In a few months, President Lula da Silva will enter his third year in office following his triumphant return to Brazilian politics. After a period marked by accusations of corruption, scandals, and problems with the justice system, the former socialist leader managed to prevail over his rival Jair Bolsonaro in the 2022 elections. However, this victory was accompanied by grand electoral promises on the part of Lula. Promises such as economic recovery, the expansion of public services, and the reinsertion of Brazil in the international sphere. Many described these objectives as mere hot air, utopian and unrealistic promises that, if implemented, would shatter what little stability the country had left.
6 months to become Argentina, a year and a half to become Venezuela.
Nevertheless, 2 years into his term, Lula da Silva seems to have surpassed all expectations. After several years falling behind other countries, the Brazilian economy has once again managed to become the 8th largest on the entire planet, surpassing Canada and Italy for the first time since 2017. Household consumption is also growing at much higher levels than expected, and contrary to what much of the opposition predicted, unemployment and inflation levels have been reduced. To give you an idea, annual inflation plummeted by half between 2022 and 2024, and the unemployment rate has fallen to 8%, which is its lowest value in the last 10 years. Lula da Silva has also accomplished his foreign policy and environmental objectives in record time, returning Brazil to its former global status by minimizing deforestation of the Amazon and participating in international affairs once again. And with all this data in hand, everything suggests that the American tiger is waking up, right? As we've already explained 1,000 times on this channel, things are often not as rosy as they seem. Despite the successes in the macro figures, government finances under Lula are going through their worst period since the pandemic. The fiscal deficit has increased by more than 93% in just 1 year. Lula lied. During his electoral campaign, he gave assurances that he would maintain the budget balance, but nothing of the sort is happening. And the worst thing is that financial instability jeopardizes both investor confidence and the country's monetary policy. So, where do we end up? Have Lula da Silva's reforms been a resounding success? Or is the Brazilian economy experiencing a kind of calm before the storm? Well, make yourselves comfortable. Today on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. And pay attention, because since we're talking about Brazil, you'll already know that one of its main industries is oil. Well then, did you know that the oil industry is at an all-time high? Despite global efforts for an energy transition, oil consumption continues to rise, and oil companies are breaking historical profit records. How is this possible? Today on Visualeconomik, we're going to tell you all about it. Lula da Silva's presidency has been characterized, besides his love for public spending, by his cold and calculated political pragmatism. After all, when the majority of both legislative chambers are against you, and your approval rating wavers every time you do something, well, you have to get very creative in order to govern the way you want to. And in Lula's case, this meant forming a large coalition with center and even center-right parties, such as the Brazilian Democratic Movement, or MDB, in order to pass his reforms in the National Congress. So desperate was the new president to find support that he appointed Geraldo Alckmin as his vice president, a Brazilian politician with connections to the conservative and pro-market right who, on top of that, ran against Lula da Silva himself during the 2006 presidential elections. In other words, he met his antithesis. Now, what does all this have to do with the economic administration of the last 2 years? Well, as you can imagine, the president has not been able to ratify 100% of his reforms. His government is a mixture of everything and nothing. The conservatives criticize Lula for being too left-wing, but the leftists criticize him for being too moderate. But do you know the best part? When economic performance began to improve last year, the narrative took a 180-degree turn. Conservatives now claim that the success is due to Jair Bolsonaro's economic legacy, while leftists attribute it to the president's reforms. The question is, what exactly are these reforms, and how can we be so sure that they are responsible for Brazil's recent growth? Regardless of how controversial the figure of Lula may be, one thing is clear. These last 2 years have been nothing short of miraculous. In 2023 alone, Brazil's real GDP grew more than twice what the IMF expected. Subsequently, last July, the fund had to correct its growth forecasts again, and not to reduce them, but rather to increase them to 2.1%. The international markets were expecting a UK-style crash in Brazil, and it backfired. Does this mean that the glorious leader Lula had brought prosperity back to Brazil with his leftist policies? Well, yes, but no. You see, the Brazilian economy depends on exporting raw materials to other countries to stay afloat. Agricultural commodities such as sugar, soybeans, and minerals such as crude oil or iron. So what does this mean? That the level of Brazilian growth depends mainly on how much raw material it can extract from the land each year, or on the ups and downs of the global economy. In other words, that in this respect, the political administration in the short term plays very little role. It could be said that the Lula da Silva government simply won the macroeconomic lottery.
May estimate forecasts record harvest of 305.4 million tons in 2023.
Last year's harvest in Brazil was one of the most prosperous in recent times. In just a few months, production of cereals, pulses, and vegetable oils grew by over 16% over 2022 thanks to better weather conditions. As if that were not enough, the increase came at the same time that the Ukrainian war was in its first year of conflict. So the all-important Ukrainian harvest did not take place, and shortages increased. Logically, this led to skyrocketing prices on international markets, allowing Brazilian exporters to sell their surpluses for a very high profit margin. The purest illustration of right place at the right time. But believe it or not, it doesn't end there. Brazilian production of hydrocarbons, such as oil, has also jumped since Lula returned to power, reaching its highest level ever in November. This, combined with rising fuel prices around the world as a result of the war in Ukraine, has further boosted Brazilian exports. Where has this resounding industrial success come from? And has good government management had anything to do with it? Well, again, the answer is no. The recent increase in Brazil's oil production has not been due to the president's policies, but rather the investments made by Petrobras. Specifically, the state-owned giant carried out the installation of 5 loading and unloading vessels, such as the FPSO P-71 and the FPSO Almirante Barroso, as part of an initiative to exploit oil reserves in the country's pre-salt layer. This project, planned since 2020, has allowed Petrobras to revitalize the production of several of its most significant deposits, such as the Marlim field, and the results have not been long in coming. In other words, the economy under Lula da Silva has not only benefited from a better harvest, but also from the benefits generated by investments made during Jair Bolsonaro's term. However, credit where credit's due. An expansion of almost 3% per year is not achieved just by accident, just as he did when he was president in the early 2000s. Lula da Silva has used his good luck to stabilize the Brazilian economy and ensure growth during his term in office. The key is bizarre monetary policy. Brazil has been enduring very high levels of inflation since the pandemic. As a result, the value of the real against the dollar has plummeted by almost 25% in just a few years, taking with it much of the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and when the effects of the 2020 crisis subsided sufficiently, the Central Bank of Brazil decided to intervene to stop the price increase once and for all. How did they do it? By increasing the interest rate. After all, interest is a kind of price for debt. It's how much it costs you to borrow money to invest or spend. And as in any market, the higher the price, the lower the demand, the less credit there will be, and the less money will circulate in the economy, causing prices to slow down. And so, interest rates rose from 2% to an incredible 13.75%, and naturally, inflation moderated. However, after this, the Brazilian economy was hit with a new problem: stagnation. In the same way that a rate hike reduces inflation, it can also reduce economic growth. If you're a company and you have plans to invest and expand your operations, will you do it if the interest rate the bank gives you exceeds 13%? Hardly. And that was just what the private sector thought. In fact, one of the reasons why the International Monetary Fund projected a reduction in Brazil's economic growth by 2023 was precisely the high interest rates and the reduction in private investment as a result. This situation presented the new president, Lula da Silva, with a very complicated dilemma for the beginning of his term. On the one hand, if he kept rates high, he would be able to control inflation, but he wouldn't be able to achieve his growth targets and would not be able to increase public spending as much as he'd promised. But on the other hand, if he decided to cut rates to reactivate the Brazilian economy, then he would have a chance of fulfilling his electoral promise. But that would risk a return to inflation and monetary chaos. Under normal circumstances, the government would have had to choose one of the two options. But fortunately for Lula, in the end, he didn't have to choose either. Why? Well, because thanks to the explosion of oil and agricultural exports mentioned before, 2024, the value of the Brazilian real soared. Everyone needed Brazilian currency to buy their products, thus creating a kind of cushion that made it possible to cut interest rates without lowering the value of the real, and thus increasing inflation. The plan was implemented starting in the summer of 2023, a few months after that year's bumper crop, and interest rates were reduced from 13.75% to 10.5%. The result was a success, which explains much of the current bonanza. Now, as incredible as this move may seem, what will happen when the miracle is over? I mean, it's not as if the trade surplus is going to be maintained forever. At some point, exports will have to come down to their usual levels, and when that happens, and the trade balance shrinks, there will no longer be enough dollars to keep borrowing cheaply. What is Lula da Silva's solution? Well, one of his favorites: regulate, tax, and spend hand over fist. Like any self-respecting socialist leader, Lula da Silva has always been a friend of public spending and the welfare state. Indeed, the creation of many of Brazil's most important social programs, such as the well-known Bolsa Familia, date back to his first term in office in the early 2000s. Consequently, most of his electoral promises focused on increasing public spending and imposing higher taxes on the upper class. And when he finally returned to power, the new president wasted no time.
Lula's spending plans turn heat on Brazilian markets.
Government spending during the first 4 months of 2023 grew by more than 8% year on year, and after 1 year, the figure jumped to 42%. But where is all this money going, you may ask? Well, into rebuilding all the social programs that his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, had cut or abolished in order to control the country's fiscal deficit. In the short term, the increase in spending, coupled with higher exports, has increased the standard of living of Brazilians. Now, who precisely is going to pay for all this? Well, as with many other politicians around the world, Lula da Silva's response is, let someone else pay for it. Since the beginning of its reforms, the government has caused a dizzying expansion of government debt in Brazil, from less than 84% of GDP to more than 86% of GDP in just 2 years. These debt levels for any developed country could become tolerable in the long term, but for an emerging economy, they could have the potential to be catastrophic. To give you an example, the US rating agency Standard & Poor's gave Brazil a credit score of BB for 2024, with 86% public debt. At the same time, Japan's credit score, with a debt level of more than 250% of its GDP, is an A. In other words, even though Japan is much more indebted than Brazil, investors are more confident that Brazil will pay back its loans than Brazil will. How is this possible? Well, because the Japanese economy is much more developed and robust than that of the South American giant. And they also have a lot of accumulated savings, so they can afford to take on larger amounts of debt without making investors wary. The thing is that if Lula da Silva wants to avoid the total collapse of the financial system, he has only two alternatives. Either he manages to gain the confidence of the financial markets to be able to continue borrowing, or he reduces the fiscal deficit. Will that end up happening? For the time being, there are two strategies on the table.
Lula launches plan to reindustrialize Brazil with 60 billion in soft loans and subsidies.
First, the Brazilian government plans to invest large amounts of money to encourage innovation and reindustrialization in the country, mainly in the form of subsidies and public loans to certain strategic sectors, which could total more than $60 billion. But on the other hand, the president has also pushed for the approval of a very ambitious tax reform, which will simplify VAT collection and improve state revenues. Will these strategies work? Well, it's difficult to say, although in general, and with a few exceptions such as Israel or Taiwan, public investment programs usually end up spending money in a very inefficient way, and that's in the best cases, because in Latin American countries, corruption typically gets in the way. Nevertheless, thanks to the previously mentioned fiscal reform and still stable GDP growth rates, it seems that the Brazilian president has managed to rebuild some of the confidence of the financial markets.
Moody's raises Brazil outlook to positive on reform progress.
But Visualeconomik community, the truth is that after only 2 years in office, it's still very difficult to draw clear conclusions about the success or failure of Lula da Silva's economic reforms. We still need more time to see how the situation progresses and evolves, and whether the president's electoral promises in 2022 were a bunch of fairy tales or the beginning of a new miracle in Latin America. However, for the moment, luck is playing a very important role in Lula's economy. In any case, the questions are now over to you. Do you think Lula da Silva is leading Brazil in the right direction? Have the last 2 years of growth been proof that his policies are working? Or are they just a temporary mirage that will end up ruining Brazilians? You can leave us your answers in the comments. As always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it. I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.